I hope you still have energy after this long day. It's my honor and my pleasure to welcome Professor Shalini Randeria for our keynote paper. I don't think that it's really necessary to introduce Professor Randeria here to you. She's very well known in Switzerland. She has been professor for social anthropology, I think, in Zurich, and she's actually the Rector for Research at the Geneva Institute, a graduate institute. She's also Rector for Institute for Human Science in Vienna. You have got your PhD at the Free University in Berlin, and she's one of the former members of the Senate of the German Research Council, which we know as DFG. She has been the president of the European Association of Social Anthropologists and a fellow of the Institute of Advanced Studies in Berlin. What I highly appreciated is also that you have been professor and chair of the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology as the CEU, the very well-known university, Central European University in Budapest. I don't want to talk too much, but I want just to name 3 of your many books Professor Randeria has published widely. And I think the border crossings, Grenzveränderung und Grenzüberschreitung in einer globalisierten Welt, is one of the very important books we need today. I like also very much From Imperialism to Empire, nicht-westliche Perspektive in einer globalisierten Welt, and Worlds on the Move, Globalisierung, Migration and Cultural Society. I personally like to watch your YouTube talks because this gives me the opportunity to follow your ideas when I'm even far away. So we are very pleased that you are here. Thank you for coming, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I think I've never had so much technology on me in my life. Maybe, is it better if I stand? Yes, of course, but I should not. Half of the technology I shouldn't drop. One sec, we need to realign some things here. This is not going to. Yes, probably all I need is maybe to move this on the one hand, and on the other hand, to fix. I don't know. I don't have a pocket. Yes, please. Good. All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You've had a long day. I think the last thing you want to do is listen to a long lecture. I'll try and be as entertaining as possible, but I'll try and at least promise to be as provocative as possible. And I hope we can then have a discussion. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be invited to speak to you this evening on the occasion of the closing conference of the program on the performances of research in humanities and social sciences. And I would like to thank for this honor, not only Swiss universities as an institution, but in particular, Dr. Haskell. As you've probably realized, I have no particular qualification to speak on the subject of research performance. In fact, I would probably be less competent than most people in this room. Perhaps the only thing which would set me apart from many of you here is my dual disciplinary location in sociology and anthropology, and that already points to one problem of the publics of knowledge production, and I'm going to tell you an anecdote on this in a moment, but also my constant transgressions, both in disciplinary and national boundaries, and the fact that for many years I couldn't make up my mind whether I wanted to be an academic or an activist. So I was both in my early career. As an academic and an activist, I was both a producer of knowledge, but I was a co-producer of social scientific knowledge. I was also a consumer and a recipient of this knowledge. And I not only worked as an activist on the same topics that I wrote about, but I also published in not only academic journals, but in the media on the same topics: forced displacement, dispossession induced by infrastructural development, legal pluralism, civil society. These have been topics which have accompanied me before I entered academia. They've continued to exercise me after that. As I said to you, my dual disciplinary location in sociology and anthropology is a good starting point to talk about how different the academic world looks like depending from where you look at it. So I came as a graduate student to do my PhD in Heidelberg in 1982 and asked whether I could be enrolled in sociology to write a PhD on legal pluralism and family law in India. And the very first question that met this query of mine was, why India? And I said it would be a good society in which to look at the whole question of family law and legal pluralism. And the answer in sociology was, aber Indien ist eigentlich keine moderne Gesellschaft. Dann können Sie keine Soziologin werden. Sie müssen in die Ethnologie. Yeah, you should become an anthropologist because India is not modern enough to be an industrial society, therefore it cannot be the object of anthropology. The anthropologists, however, felt that India was not primitive enough to be the object of anthropology. So they felt that I should go to Indology. Indology, however, thought they could not accept me because I was not a philologist. And there I was, stuck between a disciplinary division of labor, which, from the Indian context that I came from, made absolutely no sense, but in the Western context had divided up the disciplines in a very particular fashion, which cemented the kinds of knowledge which can be produced and who will consume it, under which label. And so, as you very kindly mentioned, when I was invited to establish the new department in Central European University in Budapest, I established it as a department of anthropology and sociology to show that this division is obsolete in the 21st century. And the same is true of the Graduate Institute department in Geneva that I also had the pleasure and the privilege to establish. So I think it's very much a question of from where does one think about boundaries of disciplines and of the knowledges they produce, and also of the publics to whom they are addressed. Now, before I go to more detailed questions of thinking about the publics, let me mention 2 points which are important to me. One is some of the challenges facing the production of knowledge in the social sciences against the backdrop of much larger changes, external and internal, to the university today. Who are the various publics we are trying to reach, and how does our location and language of publication affect our reach and reception? And what types of institutional formats are currently best positioned to respond to some of these shifts, political and epistemic? What are the different modes of critique and circulation of knowledge that are enabled and constrained by the increasingly utilitarian calculus within the university and a growing renationalization outside of it? And does it matter from which part of the world one thinks about all of these questions? I will argue this evening that while addressing some of these questions, location matters. Location is linked not only to access to material and symbolic resources, but it's linked intimately to the circulation and reception of scholarship. Our location, institutional, geographic, and disciplinary, influences the legacies and traditions which shape our scholarship, the theories and the concepts we use and we develop. Of course, there are huge differences between scholars here and the ways in which they transform and transgress these contexts. But this too is a matter of one's institutional and geographical location. Before I share with you some of my reflections and advance some arguments with regard to changes in knowledge production and publics, let me first sketch two components very briefly of the larger economic and political transformations that form the backdrop to these issues. The question of social sciences and their changing publics must be posed both with regard to these external conditions and with regard to changes within the university landscape, even though these changes within the university may partly be externally induced. And here I would like to point to some of the often contradictory pulls and pressures for measurement, evidence, impact, academic excellence, internationalization, and national relevance. We face today challenges as a consequence of political contestations and epistemological reconfigurations. But every time I say such a sentence, when I say we face, I realize that this we is not a homogeneous one. Whenever I speak a sentence about the university or think about social sciences, I am acutely aware that I am unable to frame a single problem, let alone a diagnosis or offer a solution that would not take into account whether I'm thinking of and from a first-class metropolitan Indian university like my first alma mater, Delhi, or a provincial Indian university, starved of resources, struggling with problems of irrelevant curricula taught in English, a language that neither faculty nor students master, or whether I'm thinking from Oxford, where I had the privilege to be a Rhodes Scholar in the pre-Thatcherite era. It was an era which knew no audits, no evaluations, no accreditation, no quality control, and yes, no internet. There was such an era. Even if it dates me, I think it's good to remind ourselves that it's only in the last 20 years that we have seen the changes which all of us have begun to take completely for granted about the way universities as institutions should be structured. The location from which I think of problems of access, quality, curriculum, the asymmetry of resources, and brain drain shapes the questions I pose and even the solutions I may propose. While problems of democratic access to universities have been solved for the most part in continental post-war Europe, especially Western Europe, let us not forget that discrimination on grounds of gender, race, religion, class, in India caste, continue to plague institutions of higher learning in most of the world, access to which continues to be a matter of a mix of merit and privilege. In the global hierarchy of knowledge production, the best institutions in the global south can only occupy the bottom rung of a global educational ladder, which would enable access to middle-class students from metropolitan locations in the global south to top Euro-American universities and labor markets. Questions about social scientific knowledge and its publics today, therefore, need to be situated, one, in this external context of a hierarchy of institutions, secondly, in my view, with regard to the growing populist distrust of science, as well as increasing inroads into academic freedom and institutional autonomy of universities. And this is as true of Turkey as of Hungary, as much true of India as of Poland. Suspicion of and hostility towards expert knowledge characterizes the post-factual world in which we live. The chickens of postmodernism seem to have come home to roost in the Brexit campaign, equally in Trump's election speeches or in Putin's pronouncements. But truth is a casualty to the relativism of perspectives. The public university is facing, therefore, an institutional crisis as a result of several contradictions. The contradictions between the demand for autonomy in the definition of the university's values and objectives and the growing pressure to hold it accountable to the same criteria of efficiency, productivity, and the use of a utilitarian logic which would be of place in a private enterprise. But also due to contradictions between demands for internationalization and at the same time for relevance of knowledge defined in narrow national terms, as well as contradictions between academic freedom and programmatic funding and agenda setting from above. This structural crisis of the public university is, of course, related to a financial crisis. Its autonomy, both pedagogical and academic, was a function of funding by the state. This dependency in itself was not problematic as long as autonomous knowledge production for its own sake was considered a value in itself. And university education was considered to be a public good, unchallenged. But over the past 20 to 30 years, and depending on which part of the world we are looking at, and here often the global south mirrors for me first the state of things to follow in Europe and America, state support dwindled and political commitment to higher education whittled down as part of the neoliberal restructuring of education and of all public services. This loss of priority of the public university paved the way for an unprecedented opening of the university to a commercialization of knowledge. But it also paved the way for a private university sector, as witnessed in India or in Turkey, that was accompanied by a large-scale devaluation of humanities and social sciences, and especially of critical social science knowledge production. The establishment of a transnational market for higher education, including franchising of universities, of course, was facilitated by the GATS, the Global Agreement in Trade and Services. And this is something I've been working on, but this would carry us too far. Of course, it's not as if this is the first time we have the transnationalization of universities. Chinese scholars were present in ancient Indian universities. Africa saw early Islamic universities. What is new, besides the ease, the speed, and the scale of this new transnationalization today, and what really sets it apart, is a new logic, and that is of commercial value. It transforms universities into profitable grounds for educational capitalism, and it changes the nature of access to institutions of higher learning, the immediacy of their relationship to the labor market, the logic by which departments and disciplines are funded, faculty recruited, and it changes the nature of the publics for whom our knowledge is, could be, or should be made relevant. Lest I be misunderstood, let me hasten to add that I have no illusions of academic freedom under state funding, under conditions of growing populism, right-wing social conservatism, and a massive renationalization. For instance, the new Polish government plans not to fund research on anything to do with gender. The Bulgarian government has just announced a plan that it will support humanities only on the condition that they advance the national cultural heritage. Or in Japan, where 26 of 60 national universities decided last year to close or scale back their humanities and social science departments, following a letter from the education minister calling upon them, and I quote, to take active steps to abolish social science and humanities organizations or to convert them to areas that better serve society's needs. End of quote. But technocratic dictates abound nearer home as well. I would like to remind you that the EU would also like to focus research funding on what it calls real solutions to real problems, as Commissioner Carlos Moedas put it. But the question is, who defines these real problems? And according to which criteria? A definition of society's needs or of real problems are vexed questions at the best of times. They're especially of concern given, on the one hand, the rise of illiberal democracies and of utilitarian reductionism. Illiberal democracies, because of the divorce between liberalism and democracy in ever more countries of the world, which is based on and legitimized in terms of a definition of the people in ethno-religious terms. And so society's needs can be defined very much based on a majoritarian argument about who belongs and who constitutes that society. A technocratic logic of demand-driven knowledge and production for profit is problematic because it transforms, as Boaventura de Sousa Santos has pointed out in a very, very powerful argument, because it transforms the university into a business. an entity that not only produces for the market, but which is itself produced as a market of services like administration, teaching programs and materials, certification, accreditation. These transformations are, interestingly, both a cause and also a consequence of the altered relationship between knowledge and society. Let me mention only one aspect of this change. Today, society is no longer just an object of social scientific knowledge, but it has become a subject which talks back. Locations of knowledge production have multiplied outside of the university, and they have become heterogeneous, with ambivalent consequences. They encompass not only university-industry partnerships, which don't concern me because these are rare in social sciences, but social science knowledge production in the global south has shifted to a very large degree to production for international organizations, governments, private corporations, a point that I return to in the second part of the talk. But there is also a very different kind of knowledge that is being produced by vulnerable social groups. Think of the rise of disability studies in the last years, or of communities of chronically ill patients who are also producing knowledge about themselves. Or think of environmental knowledge produced by civil society institutions, social movements and NGOs on seeds, on climate change. The whole contestation of genetically modified seeds in Brazil, in India, has not come from within the university, but has come entirely from social movements, producing knowledge with which they have gone to court against the commercialization of biogenetic material. The knowledge of some of these local communities or social movements is often marginalized by the pejorative label of local knowledge, as opposed to knowledge produced in the universities that claims universality, be these universities in the north or the global south. But also think of the very different case of non-professional or so-called popular history writing that is beginning to contest academic historiography in many, many parts of the world in a bid to redefine the past. This is true of Ukraine, of Hungary, India, or South Africa. Locations of knowledge production with their very varied publics that they address are extremely different in each of these cases, and I think these would merit our attention. A greater public participation in such a pluriverse of knowledge changes not only the nature of knowledge production, its criteria of validation, understandings of social responsibility, but also of relevance. The issue of relevance, which I will just allude to very briefly here, is a complex one. Apart from the question of the criteria of relevance, or whether relevance should be a criteria for the assessment of quality and of the funding of social sciences at all, is the question of plural publics that I am raising here. And this raises the question, relevant for whom? Where and which are the diverse constituencies for which my research should be or could be made relevant? And does relevance apply the same regardless of location and the particular public to whom, for whom, the knowledge that I'm producing is addressed? Historical and social science knowledge can have very different moral valences and political implications depending on where it is written and where it is read. The reception of scholarship varies with the publics to whom it is addressed, as well as with one's institutional locus. Michael Burroway distinguished between professional sociology and public sociology and critical sociology, each with very different aims, languages, and publics. But we shouldn't take the desire for transnationalization of any of these sociologies for granted. Many sociologists in Japan or Russia today are consciously only addressing and interested in addressing national or regional audiences. Scholarly interests and agendas of those whose work is applied in nature and thus aimed at national academic and policy constituencies differs considerably from theoretically oriented scholarship which addresses domestic academic audiences as much as readerships outside of their own national context. And I think it is important to cultivate a sensitivity for the differences of tone, of intensity, and of pitch that mark social science scholarship in different contexts. Evaluation schemes and auditing at universities all over the world has intensified stratification, both within and between nations, as universities compete with one another, nationally and globally, and the few are rewarded at the expense of many, drawing research away often from national issues and local publics by tailoring it increasingly to the fashions and concerns of northern academia. This impoverishes social sciences both in North and South, as Michael Berrouet has convincingly argued. Who are the publics in and outside of academia who are recipients of our research, and can they be separated from the various new co-producers of knowledge, from international organizations to local communities, from NGOs to corporate-funded think tanks? I would like to remind you, for instance, here of the dilemmas of Iranian colleagues, Iranian sociologists who are writing for audiences within the country but also outside it, and who point out that they are caught between the westernization that comes at political risks and Islamicization as the country vacillates between reform and repression. The public, or a public, for whom one writes is not simply pre-given or pre-existing. It must be brought into existence, to use John Dewey's phrase. And it also comes into existence in particular sites. A public needs a place, and it requires particular mediations. It doesn't simply exist by virtue of being addressed, as Michael Werner famously put it. And I would like to delineate, in the second part of the talk, some of the hierarchies of academic knowledge and their publics using the analogy of, and a surprising analogy, of the Indian caste system. Probably my choice of the metaphor of castes for academia won't come as a surprise. I come from India. But the idea of castes immediately conjures up a vision of a status hierarchy, and I think this is true of academia as well. I don't refer here to the hierarchy of disciplines that would place economics at the top and my discipline, anthropology, probably at the bottom. When I came to Heidelberg in 1982, the first two German words I learned at the university were Orchideenfach and Brotlose Kunst. These were the two words which referred to my discipline. And these have stayed in my mind as on my very first day, these were the two German words I learned. They were difficult to find, by the way, in a dictionary as well. So it was very interesting. I would like to reflect here with you instead, not on the Brotlose Kunst of ethnology, but I would like to think about the Brahmins, the warriors, and the merchants as castes within each discipline. Like in the caste system, prestige in academia doesn't always correspond with high material benefit or economic resources. Brahmins producing high theoretical knowledge may enjoy tremendous academic respect. But it is the merchants producing a very different kind of knowledge, we may call it applied research, if we like, Auftragsforschung, policy briefs, who not only often earn more, but it is their earnings, so-called Drittmittel, that support the entire system of social sciences, which is starved of adequate funding. Warriors in this scheme are a middle caste. We may call them a mediating caste. They have a close relationship to the Brahmins, whose pure theory they participate in, but they also, unlike the Brahmins, want to engage with the world, and with a variety of publics who make up that world. If Brahmins provide the academic legitimacy and prestige of high theory, without the activities of warriors and merchants, academic institutions would be starved of funds, and they would be ivory towers. My conceptualization of academic castes thus cuts across disciplines, though of course what it means to engage with the world depends and differs according to one's discipline. While economists and political scientists are much more likely to be in conversation with politicians, think tanks, and policy circles, my tribe, the social anthropologists, is primarily involved with a very different kind of publics, NGOs, social movements. I can't think of many economists who would have those as their publics, local communities. Those anthropologists who agreed to be embedded in the US armed forces in Afghanistan and Iraq in order to do fieldwork on these wars came in for enormous criticism in the discipline. So the extent to which these publics are politicized and how that politicization is theorized and received in the discipline differs also. Not only have these various disciplines fenced themselves off from one another, they police their borders very differently. Each has its own cultures of publication and promotion, its own tribal heroes, its own rituals of commemoration. And of course, one of the reasons, if you ask economists what makes their discipline different from all of ours, is they say, we are the only one which has a Nobel Prize. So in disciplinary hierarchy, very interesting kinds of honors and commemoration count. My analogy with the caste system here is not in order to rank different disciplines in terms of a hierarchy, but in order to distinguish different styles of knowledge production, different academic cultures, each cultivating a different habitus, and of course addressing different publics within a discipline and across discipline. All social science disciplines have their Brahmins, their warriors, and their merchants. One's academic caste is often as much a matter of one's self-image as of perception by others. Take, for instance, sociology. I think we could draw a contrast here to very quickly sketch the difference between the quintessential Brahmin, Niklas Luhmann, and Ulrich Beck, the warrior. Both wrote the same language, German, but in a very different language and style. Both were keen to engage large audiences beyond academia, but addressed them very differently. Two very different personalities with different academic interests, but also different research and writing styles addressing very different publics. In a world of indicators, audits, and top-down requirements of internationalization, I wonder how much space will soon be left for such a diversity of approaches within a discipline. What I want to stress about the academic caste system is the interdependence of castes, which is also a central feature of the caste system. Brahmins, I think, should enjoy the luxury of producing knowledge for a purely academic audience. Every university and every social science research institution needs its high priests. Social relevance of knowledge is only one feature, one criteria by which we can judge some kinds of academic knowledge. It would be a mistake to turn it into a yardstick of all research. While merchants cater to the marketplace for knowledge in many areas that are vital for policy making and implementation, warriors produce knowledge that addresses several audiences simultaneously within academia and beyond. They too derive their academic legitimacy from the quality of their research publications, and it's in top peer-reviewed journals. The problems they choose to address may be of a very different kind than those from a purely theoretical nature. But they may also choose to engage with a different constituency when it comes to the placement of their graduate students. I think it matters whether I want my students to work later in NGOs and international organizations, or whether my students are all going to be trained to enter the academic labor market, and of course, where. Here, a highly significant issue that I want to dwell on for a little bit is one of language. The production and circulation of social science publications are heavily biased increasingly towards English. Such linguistic hegemony comes at a price. It marginalizes perspectives and paradigms embedded in other linguistic and cultural traditions, thus impoverishing social sciences as a whole. The extent of this impoverishment varies. This is less true of economics as a discipline and of quantitative scholarship in all disciplines than it would be of sociology or anthropology, for instance. Different disciplines, of course, are also internationalized to different degrees, depending on their subject matters and the epistemic communities of which they are a part. Internationalization as a term is much more than just Europeanization or Americanization. It can mean very different things. It can mean sending our graduate students to the best institutions in the world. It can also mean making our educational institutions attractive to students from all over the world. It can also mean borrowing of ideas, institutional designs, and faculty from not only erstwhile diaspora in the UK and the US, as continental European universities are these days increasingly doing, but also opening one's doors to international academics as visiting faculty, postdocs, in joint teaching programs. It could also mean part-time joint appointments with universities in the global south to prevent a brain drain, as some of the best universities in the US do. It is remarkable for me to see how selectively continental Europe has been importing some features of Anglo-American universities, and here too, the only ones they have in mind are the Ivy League and Oxbridge. And they forget that these universities make up the very top of a rather rich system of Ivy League universities. And the features that have been borrowed have been taken completely out of context. One little detail has been overlooked, and that is the key role of financial resources. All of the universities that we are trying to emulate from are universities with a history of endowment. Rich endowments which are the bedrock of these institutions. Internationalization without these resources of one's own is going to be highly problematic. Equally problematic it would be to assume that the use of a common academic language like English will lead to an integrated global academic community. Nothing could be further from the truth in my view. On the contrary, among the deepest inequalities in the academic world today are due to issues of language. Pressures of internationalization and to publish in a small number of top-ranked British and US American journals and university presses not only skew access, but they affect style and content of publication, and they concentrate academic power even further. While no one can deny the impact of differential access to resources or the impact of asymmetrical global flow of ideas, one nevertheless cannot assume a simple relation of hegemony between metropolitan centers and so-called regional peripheries. I would therefore caution against attempts to read political or epistemological positionality into the geographic locations or origins of scholars, even though it's important to acknowledge that the loci of enunciation matter. I cannot imagine how often I get telephone calls which say to me, we would like to invite you to come and give a talk to give a Hindu perspective on something. And I look a little puzzled and then I say, but I'm sorry, why do you think I would have a Hindu perspective? And then they say, oh, sorry, so are you Muslim? I said, no. Are you Christian? I said, no. Why do you think I would have a religious perspective on anything at all? And it's a well-meant idea to think of a diversity, but it forces me to inhabit locations from which I would not feel comfortable speaking at all. And I often end this conversation by saying I come from a militantly atheist, fundamentalist, secularist family in India. The last location I could inhabit and speak from would be a Hindu one. So I think these are complicated questions from where we are looking at the world and the vantage point from which we choose to speak. But I would also like to share with you a different worry about the current pressure to publish primarily in English and in Anglo-American peer-reviewed journal and academic presses. And let me dwell on it for a moment, and then I'm done, as I address the issue of various reading and listening publics. Our choice of English as a language, of course, broadens the readerships internationally to whom we can address our work, but it creates often barriers to communication with the national public sphere. And if we do not publish bilingually, we would lose the national public in Switzerland that is primarily a German or a French reading and speaking one. And this, I think, would be a mistake. We cannot afford, in my view, to lose touch with that public, the national public, for many reasons. Social sciences not only need public support if they are to continue being funded by the national taxpayer, but social science research is, or at least ought to be made relevant to public debates, which are often local and national public debates. Social scientists are able to and should be able to intervene in public debates on important issues of our times with robust empirical evidence, with new arguments that influence and may alter the terms of the debate, and that are able to offer a variety of critical perspectives, which often render an issue more complex, but are the foundations on which a serious political culture of debating alternatives must rest. Sustained interaction with a variety of audiences in our domestic context is important because it enriches policy debates, it shapes public opinion, and it also contributes more generally to politische Bildung, a term which I think interestingly has no English equivalent. Reflections on the specificities of our national historical experiences and institutional contexts that are lost in translation would lead me too far afield. But I do want to touch on the question of translation from just one more point of view before I close. Let us not forget that addressing a variety of audiences needs different languages, even within English or German or French. The language of policy documents varies from that of academic journal articles or monographs. Quantification, visual representations, of course, are different languages altogether. Warriors who produce knowledge both for academic peers and for wider publics need good translation skills as they move from English to German or French, but also as they move from academic publications to those intended for policy circles, or as they move from talking to the general public to academic journal writing or policy briefs and newspaper articles. And I think it is important to mentor our students to writing for a variety of broader audiences, working with them on the problems of translation across these different publics, each with languages of their own, and within the same language across audiences, while providing them with access to academic and non-academic publication networks to reach a variety of readerships. The question, of course, of medium of communication here is an important one, because I find that more and more of my students read less and less books in any language. But they listen to TED Talks, they watch YouTube lectures delivered in any part of the globe. So our publics are not only stratified by language, they are stratified by generation. To reach out to a young international public, the use of English is necessary, but it is not sufficient. And I don't need to remind you here in this room that most academic journals today have migrated from academic to commercial publishers. They are so expensive now that university libraries in most countries of the global south can no longer afford subscriptions or online access to journal databanks. Open access publications provide broad readership, but it comes with its own exclusions. Some commercial publishers of academic journals in my field charge $2,000 for publications. Others charge $2,000 for simply submission and reviewing an article. And at academic monthly salaries ranging on the average from 200 euros in Kiev to 1,000 euros in Athens, let alone academic salaries in Africa or India, many of our European colleagues are already excluded from publishing in these journals. And I think this is something which is an extremely serious asymmetry which we need to be aware of and to address. I've spoken of two kinds of translations, linguistic and across audiences and publics within the same language. Let me then finally close with some remarks on institutional translation. Scholarship today is global, but successful academic institution building can only be local. In the continental European hurry to catch up with Anglo-American top universities, there is constant comparison and borrowing, some useful, some based on misunderstandings and misperceptions. But most of it ignores the fact that successful institution building in academia, as also elsewhere, needs local adaptation, not imitation. Context matters. Successful institutions are anchored in a specific time and a specific place that is not amenable to import. And it is here that institutional translations become important. The early 20th century divide between the policy-oriented, pragmatic social research on the American side and the academic, theory-oriented social sciences in Europe, especially continental Europe, is a matter of the past. But successful institution building remains an intercultural process, interwoven both with political intentions and practical consequences, and thus highly specific to a national or an urban local context. How much more complex then are the problems of transposing Western ideas and institutions, protocols of knowledge production to the global South in order to rethink the university as an institution and social sciences in the 20th century in a manner that would be context specific. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your brilliant and thought-provoking talk. I think there will be some reactions in the audience. Questions, comments. Virginia.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk, and I'm very grateful that you addressed the social conditions of knowledge productions, because I had the feeling also earlier today that we have been discussing this question of evaluation, impact, etc., in very abstract and sanitized terms. How can we assess quality? Really, can we define criteria? But I think something that we addressed very little, at least in the parts of the conference that I attended, was well, things that you mentioned now. There are academics who do not earn enough to pay their rent and need to hold a second job to survive. That is certainly not the case in Switzerland. We are very, very, very privileged, of course, but even here there are all the questions of having a family, the imposition of mobility as a quality criterion. It's very hard to get a tenured position if you do not have mobility in your CV, or it's difficult or next to impossible to get postdoctoral funding from the SNF if you are not willing to go abroad for quite a long time, for a year and a half or so. And other aspects that we all are familiar with, but I think that impact very strongly on the quality of the research, the time that we can devote to our research, and all that. I'm not sure, this doesn't come out as a question, but maybe you can comment.
No, but I think you're absolutely right. And thank you so much for pointing out the two things that I didn't, I think, emphasize enough. One is the combination of family and university careers. I mean, if you look at the statistics, and you know this much better than I do, it's really it's sort of really striking, especially if you come from India. Two things were striking when I came, and they still remain striking for me: the low number of women in academia, and how the gender pyramid looks. The percentage decreases from even a discipline like mine, where you would have 90% of students who are women, and then you will have hardly, now maybe 20% or 30% of women professors. But the other thing is how few of these women have children. And this is something which, if you come from India, this is the first thing which strikes you in Europe, about the difficult structural conditions both for women in academia and conditions for young families. And I think the second, I think on the first we've done quite a bit of work in the last 30 years that I've been in Europe. The number of women in professorships has definitely gone up. But as far as young families are concerned, I think the major problem is exactly the stage at which you need to get tenure is the one which collides with family planning. And I think there are some serious structural problems. And the second problem you point to is the precariousness of, until you get tenure, which often in continental Europe can be mid-40s, you still are in economically precarious position. And this, I think, has enormous consequences for the kinds of dependency, for the kinds of lack of autonomy, for the lack of the kinds of career paths that people are willing to follow in academia or not.
Any other question? Yes, please.
Axel Marion, Swiss Universities. Thank you very much for your talk, very inspiring. I have mainly two questions. The first one is about open access. You just addressed the question, but very briefly. Perhaps you could develop on that. Is this a solution for a more open and a more accessible access to knowledge? And you addressed also the problems of open access. Is it a reproduction of the actual system, which has a lot of problems, of course, in terms of equality, in terms of also distribution of knowledge and of money in the field? And my other question is about the vulgarization of science. You also addressed the new generation, the access of social medias, the TEDx, and so on, these types of tools, and I couldn't really understand if you think it's a good thing or if it's well, I guess it's something good, but if is that also a problem in the fact that it simplifies the quality of science? So my question is that a risk to simplify and to get a less incisive, a less acute science in the field? And perhaps you could just, well, I would be very interested.
Thank you very much. So these are very important questions. I think on the open access question, the jury is out. I think it certainly is not a panacea because it does not create a level playing field. It is able to open out certain kinds of knowledge and especially journal publications to people who would not have had access before. But there are technological barriers, there are language barriers simply, but the major barriers is resources. It is just too expensive. And it's expensive to publish. Also, it's not only just expensive to access; it's very expensive to publish. And unless you know, I have students who it's from our research grants that we can take the money to publish an open access paper, but our students can't. And this makes it really, really difficult because it's the concentration of academic journals is in commercial publication houses, and this concentration has shifted the entire paradigm and the calculus of academic publishing. And so it is, yes, open access, but no, it's concentrating these publications in just journals with subscriptions that are unaffordable. I mean, forget a small African university. Delhi University has stopped subscribing to so many of the journals, which you and I would take for granted, because they are bundled in ways which pushes up the price so much that they just cannot afford them anymore. So it's a solution to, it's a part solution, but one that still needs a lot more even distribution of resources for it really to be able to be a solution to distribution and access question. The vulgarization, I think you misunderstood me. I think this is a very complicated question, because I think what the opening out of the production of knowledge outside of academia does is that it introduces a large number of heterogeneous producers of knowledge. And these can be of totally different quality, of totally different kinds, with extremely different implications for what kind of knowledge is being produced. So I think it's very interesting. For example, one of the research projects that I do is looking at what I call the seed wars. This is where the legal contestation of genetically modified seeds in India and Brazil is taking place in the courtrooms. And all the knowledge which is being used in these court cases is knowledge produced by NGOs and by social movements, because India, it's not a North-South question. This is the interesting one, because the Indian universities are producing knowledge with the corporations. So the contestation comes from somewhere else. So this is not a North-South divide. This is a question of the production of alternative knowledge to contest university knowledge on both sides, North and South, because on both sides it's linked to corporations with an interest in a certain kind of seed. So would this be called a simplification of knowledge? I don't know. What they are producing is knowledge which is, if you like, what they would say is countering the hegemonic knowledge, but of universities in the South as much as of universities in the North, right? Secondly, the second example I had was of a very different kind of knowledge production, and that is popular history. And popular history writing is a very worrying kind of knowledge production for me, because they are challenging the historian's craft in very fundamental ways, which leads us to extremely complicated questions of evidence, of methodology, of the interweaving of politics and academic knowledge. But interestingly, in all of these cases, of course, what complicates this whole story as it's very much part of a populist agenda in all of these countries, in Russia as much as in India, in Ukraine, in Hungary, and where school textbooks are being rewritten on a massive scale. So the popular can get into the canonical and the boundaries can be very flexible. And I think, therefore, so I'm not making a case for saying any knowledge produced outside the university needs to be valorized. On the contrary, I think all I'm saying is we have a situation which we have not had before, where the loci of production of knowledge are extremely heterogeneous and are addressing very different publics. So you and I may consider a lot of this popular history no history at all. We would say this is myth and not history, right? But they are making the claim that this is history written from a different perspective. And this is, what complicates this whole story is also the entire question of perspectivity. Because once you get marginalized groups writing particularistic histories, challenging certain universalizing narratives, especially national historical narratives, you have very many contested histories. And the question is, what kind of evidence can you use in order to assess the merits on the claims of these different positions? And I think that is a debate we really need to have, rather than dismissing all of this as not academic knowledge. I think that divide doesn't help us. I think we really need to get into questions of evidence, of what counts as evidence, what kinds of particularistic claims have a justification, what can they, what are the grounds on which we are going to have a conversation about what counts as evidence at all. Because otherwise, I think we really slide towards this totally, post-factual world in which there is no distinction between fact and fiction, which is what we have been seeing now in so many of the contexts that I was sketching briefly. And I think that's an extremely worrying development.
In the first part of your talk, you said that it is increasingly difficult for research to be funded even in our beloved European knowledge society, to be funded, if not bringing real answers to real problems, as they say. But maybe this issue hides another one, because if you and me would open tomorrow a university of unreal answers to unreal problems, we would still have to fix these questions. What will be our audience? Who will be our partners? What will be our role? How will the employers respond to the production of these more intelligent people with unreal answers to unreal problems? If I follow what you said in the second part of your talk, it seems that civil society has de facto filled that gap. That they are the informal global university of unreal answers to unreal problems. You seem to forget, but I think you know that most of these clubs of informal knowledge are indeed funded either publicly or by corporations. Quite often it is even the ultimate goal. So is there still a place for university under a less fancy name, universities of unreal answers to unreal problems? And is the key to that to convince, for instance, employers that they should not stick to a model they don't believe in themselves?
So thank you. This is a great question. It's in fact a whole set of questions. So I don't think the opposite is true. I think this is no. I mean, if I'm concerned about the narrowing of research funding to real solutions to real problems, I don't think the opposite holds. That therefore I want all of us to be working on unreal solutions to unreal problems. I think one problem I have with the real solutions and real problems or societal needs, like in Japan, is who defines what is a real problem, right? And for whom is it a problem? And I think this is the whole question of a problem definition becomes a very, very important one here. And if we can generate certain kinds of social consensus around what these problems are, then I think this is certainly a valuable consensus. The question is, should universities restrict their knowledge production to what has been defined, even through consensus, as a real problem? And I think that it has several parts to it. In a sense, often we don't even know what the solutions to these problems are. Fundamental research is about doing research not for a real problem at all, but for a theoretical problem, which is not a real problem so it's a real problem, but it's not a problem in the real world that you're trying to solve. So the question is not, how do I restrict migration? Right? This would be a real problem. If anybody had a real solution to it, I think the EU would be very happy. The question here is, what could be the role of universities in producing knowledge, which, as I said, could be Brahmanical knowledge. Brahmin knowledge, not applied, not of any immediate use. Maybe it has a use someday, sometime.
50 years ago, this was unchallenged.
Exactly. Absolutely. But this is exactly where I think the problem is, because I think we have a model of academic freedom and of the university, which 50 years ago for us was totally self-evident, that you and I could go and write a book on something that maybe 5 people would read. Maybe it didn't even solve any kind of real problem in the real world. Maybe it would later. We don't know. In natural sciences, as often was the case, fundamental research turned out to be solutions to problems that were discovered much later. So a lot of this is about accidental, serendipitous knowledge. But it's not only that. In the social sciences, I think, the problem with this apart from the definitional issue, is the problem. If you are asked to produce only real solutions to real problems, I think it is at least doing two things. It is removing the search for various alternatives, and it is basically not about producing critical knowledge at all. But it's about solving problems which need to be solved, but that cannot be the only function of a university. I think we would really be tying down our own hands if we agreed that this is what the only thing which a university should do. And this depends, of course, on our disciplines, right? I mean, if there's a real engineering problem, we do want a real solution to it. We don't want an unreal bridge, or we don't want medical problems to be solved in the same fashion that we would want what is a problem in literature or in philosophy or in anthropology, for that matter. And I think those I don't want to be narrowed down to definitions of what is a real problem which merits a real solution, and only then it can be funded. The second set of problems that you were raising is equally important to say. So I don't think civil society has filled the gap, but I think what we are seeing increasingly is a lot of alternative knowledge production outside of the university. This can be corporately funded think tanks, they can be civil society or NGOs. Who funds them? Whom do they represent? These are big questions. Many of them in the Global South are funded by foundations in the North, leading to a lot of problems of their legitimacy and questions of representation in very many contexts. So we need to think about a whole host of problems there. But I think if we realize that there are very many other actors out there who are producing, many other actors, except for academic knowledge production within the university, I think the question would be what kinds of bridges can one build? And then again the question of how we're going to adjudicate between alternative claims. Do we have answers to when we have different claims? How are we going to then set the criteria and evaluate between them? Because I think not all can be left in a world of just relative knowledge production. This is what is also one of the problems we are facing now.
I tried to a bit take the debates we had today, which was the first panel on impact, the second one on emerging scholars. And one thing what I have seen when I've been discussing, especially with young emerging scholars, that there are like two narratives. The one who are more maybe tendentially more in social science, who say, yes, we actually are political activists, we have this approach to have a meaningful research with challenge current problems, and who somehow criticize that the system also of evaluation doesn't take this into account, and you have to publish in papers and journal and so on. And the other, let's say, narrative I hear from people, maybe tendentially more from humanities, who say, no, now there is this impact paradigm, and we have no space for our fundamental research. So it's like both. And my question is, do you think there could be a possibility to answer to both demands, that especially, let's say, young researchers who want more have this impact on the research can have a system which respond to that, but also the one who say, no, we want to have the time and the space for very fundamental research dealing with more, let's say, humanities questions. We also want space. So you think that has to be a conflict which is becoming even stronger?
Well, this is a large set of questions, and it's difficult to answer without context, which is why I kept saying context matters. It depends on whether you're answering this question in Switzerland. I think the space for critical research or humanities here is just totally different than it is in Poland, Hungary, Russia, Turkey. And I think we forget what a luxurious world we are living in. And if we are complaining at a level of luxury which is unprecedented and unparalleled. So I think one really has to remember the context in which this question needs to be asked about the relevance and about the existential problems. That's why I was saying the problems faced by our Iranian colleagues about the contradictory pulls of relevance. Are they writing for a national audience in which to be relevant you have to have a certain kind of Islamic understanding and ideology, as against if you're writing for an international audience, you would be of course writing in a very different language and a very different framing, but the fact that you do that can put your academic career at risk at home. So this is not just about reputational risks. These are real risks. And physical, by real, I mean to the threat of, you could lose a job. We are seeing what is happening in Turkey at the moment. Large-scale loss of jobs. So I think these are not just questions for young scholars, right? These are questions of the kinds of research problems you may address at your peril. How much freedom would you have? What does academic freedom mean in different contexts? Does that mean also the freedom to get funding for the kinds of research that I want to do? Or do I say, even if nobody wants to fund it, this is so important to me that I have the luxury in Switzerland or in England to still do it. And I think this is a luxury which very few of us have. So my answer to these questions is very much contextual. If you are in Lagos or in the Ivory Coast or in Kenya, this is a question you cannot ask yourself because you have outside of academia 2 other jobs in order to be able to feed your family. And therefore you would then go into consultancies with international organizations, with international NGOs, and be producing knowledge around questions which somebody else has framed for you. So you are producing just empirical material to be fitted into frameworks and theories and projects and problem definitions which come from elsewhere, using concepts and vocabularies also coming from elsewhere. So your hands are tied epistemologically and financially. So I think there is so much to unpack there and to think about questions of impact. How do we measure impact at all, and on whom do we want to measure impact? What does relevance mean? What criteria can be used? What does academic freedom mean in these very different contexts? And I think these are really serious challenges.
Any more comments, questions? If not, I thank you very much for this still energizing and inspiring talk. You have raised a lot of very interesting questions and issues. And I want to thank you all.